postdoctoral researcher here at the Center of Bionetworking. I'd like to welcome you to the panel on medical and wellness tourism. Today we're very honored to have with us on the panel Dr. Newland, who's a reader at the Department of Social Policy and Social Work at the University of York. Neil was a lead researcher on the project called Inward and Outward Implications for the NHS of Medical Tourism, which was funded by the National Institute for Health Research and with colleagues at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, as well as the University of Birmingham, Royal Holloway and Sheffield Teaching Hospitals Foundations. And I think if you kind of read newspapers about medical tourism in recent years, you'll come across their work quite a lot. And next we have Kristen Bradshaw, who's a research fellow at the Health Law Institute, University of Alberta in Canada, and also a PhD candidate in applied linguistics and discourse studies at Carleton University in Canada. As a research fellow, Kristen has done a lot of work analyzing kind of media representations of not only stem cells but other medical innovations as well. And I've just learned today that her PhD topic's actually to do with obesity and policy, so it's a wide range of topics. And next we have Alessandro Bassini, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health, Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toulouse. Is that right? Yes. And he received interdisciplinary training for his PhD in bioethics, STS, so, and also molecular biology in the University of Milan European School of Molecular Medicine. And he's done a lot of work on comparative research and regulatory controversies surrounding the provision of unproven stem cell therapies in both the US and Europe. And unfortunately, two of our panelists haven't been able to come today. Masai Kato is not well, so she can't come today. And Laurent Horde hasn't made it to the conference yet. He might turn up later. But we're going to start with Neil.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And we're going to give you about 15 to 20 minutes.
Sounds good, great, thanks. Okay. I'll try and talk there for about 15 or 20 minutes. I'm going to talk about a project that myself and colleagues undertook. It was funded by the NHR that looked at inward and outward medical tourism. As background, I'm a researcher in health and social services, and I want to talk about the emergence of this idea of medical tourism. I'm very much aware that the focus has been on discussions that really were at the edges of some of the work that we were undertaking. We were looking very much at, I suppose, bread and butter health treatments that encompass things like cosmetic and fertility and elective surgery. But perhaps in the questions we can move into some discussion about stem cell and cell therapies. Four things I'll try and do: give you some background and really focus on networks within the study. So knowledge networks, demand side networks and supply side networks. Quotes. I suppose all of the discussion in the 2 days is encapsulated within this notion of globalization, and thinking about medical tourism is no different. We've seen some major changes from thinking about health policy being delivered within a national state, container state environment to beginning to span national boundaries. We're aware of a range of developments that have gone on in terms of economics, in terms of political relationships, technology and social trends, which really have intensified the movements across borders of ideas, of goods and services, of clinicians, of IT and so on. Medical tourism is embedded in these flows. And it's also worth remembering, and I think it was interesting, one of the final questions of the last session touched on this, about this notion of health trade, that medical tourism is an export for a country. So even though patients arrive to be treated within that country, that counts as a health export. It's also worth saying that medical travel has elements that are both old and new. If you're in a room full of historians, they say medical tourism is nothing new. People have been travelling for centuries for the healing properties of waters and places. I think that's true, and we can acknowledge that, but certainly medical travel, as we currently experience it, has many new dimensions in terms of the number of flows and some of the drivers. So I'm going to define medical tourism as where individuals travel outside of their own country of residence, jurisdiction, the primary intention of receiving medical, usually elective surgery treatments, and those are paid out of pocket by themselves or third-party payments, perhaps by their sponsoring government. Our study covered cosmetic, it covered fertility, it covered dental, it covered bariatric surgery and a range of other treatments as well. As Ntaka has mentioned, there's a final report that's available that brings all of this work together. Myself and a number of colleagues at UK institutions. And what we tried to do through the work that was, I suppose, was undertaken over about 2.5 years was really to make sense of this medical tourism development within the UK and think about its implications for the National Health Service. We had 4 streams of activity. We tried to understand choice. What was it that people were using to make choices? What sort of decision-making models? Did they use intermediaries? So all of that individual and group-focused decision-making dynamic. Second thing we really wanted to focus on was patient quality and safety, to really think about a range of legal issues, issues of accreditation, continuity, and so on. We wanted to broaden it as well and to think about medical travel as an industry and to think about what different players, stakeholders and countries sought to get from that development. And that raised a number of questions there in terms of impact on sending and receiving countries and also professional implications. And probably the most difficult thing, the fourth thing, we were trying to actually put some value on some of the flows, to think about what it cost and how it benefited the NHS system. The methods we used were very diverse. We had policy analysis, we had desk-based reviews, we had economic analysis, but we also had some treatment case studies. And the case studies were based around 5 examples: bariatric, fertility, cosmetic, and dental. But then also we had diaspora case studies as well, and I'll say a little bit more about that as we go through. We were mixed methods. We used qualitative and quantitative work. We had systematic review. We had a legal and policy review as well. And we had a number of in-depth interviews with a range of individuals that were involved at a clinical level within the NHS, those that were involved in the industry side, overseas and in the UK. We talked to NHS managers, and of course we also talked to people that had travelled out of the UK for treatments. Okay, so that's the background to the study. It's a fairly wide-ranging study. Some of the findings we focus on in terms of what motivates individuals to travel. We've looked at some of the cost implications in other papers. We've drilled down and looked in detail at bariatric issues. We've thought about a range of things that really slice up the data Here I want to talk about this notion of networks. I think networks are really important in terms of thinking about medical tourism. And the first thing I want to talk about is knowledge networks. And when we started the work and started thinking about it in 2010, I think there's an interesting process going on of a range of industry stakeholders trying to legitimate and promote medical tourism. And I think what was really interesting is when we look back, we can see that 2008, 2009 was really a sort of very high tide of medical tourism, a real set of expectations about what it was going to mean, the numbers that we're going to engage in. And I think there's been more of a realism within the industry and the media since then. Well, that process is interesting. John Connell at Sydney University talks about it as being this process of boosterism. And I think that's worth an examination, because in this push to have people travel out of jurisdiction, to go to Europe, to go to Asia for treatments, there's a range of interests in terms of people establishing websites and providing information. There's advertisers, there's people that set up trade fairs, there's people that want to be brokers to act as middle people, helping you on the ground with translation and linking you up with particular clinics. We've seen the emergence of interest in new products. You travel abroad on your normal travel insurance policy and you're going for cosmetic or dental work, your policy is invalid. Okay, if you look at the small print, it says you can't go for health treatment. So we've seen some new products enter the market where people try not only to cover you for loss and delay, but also to actually insure you against the risk of that treatment going wrong. So they'll pay for you to go back and have it redone. There's a whole range of providers, there's people involved in travel, people involved in accrediting the industry, giving you a badge of approval to say you're a great clinic, you offer a great service. And of course, in there as well, we've got national strategies. Many governments, and I would say in a curious way, the UK is one of these, have invested in trying to ensure that their country is part of the medical tourism and international patient platform. Now, key thing you might be thinking about is, what are the flows? What are the numbers in terms of medical tourism? Who travels where for what? We've got two main points in the debate that emerged towards the end of the 2000s. We had this Deloitte statement that 750 Americans travelled in 2007. They had a really broad definition. They scaled that up and said there's 6 million people globally travelling for medical treatment. Far more conservatively, we had McKinsey say, no, the global figure's about 60 to 80,000. They had a very narrow definition. Clinics and providers had to be JCI accredited. They excluded many treatments as not being within their remit. Now, those two reports come out. Which one fuels the academic and media imagination? It's the Deloitte one. And that's picked up and that's given as a statement almost of fact within this emerging discussion of medical tourism. So at the moment, there are 6 million medical tourists and it's only going to grow. And that's the sort of received orthodoxy that existed towards the end of the 2000s. Now, if you've ever seen a McKinsey and a Deloitte report, they're beautiful things, beautifully presented, and as academics, we sort of look very jealously at what they do with graphics and how they really get their messages across. But I think it's worth looking at the Deloitte report because it really became a pillar within the debate and fueled this discussion about medical tourism. You go to their report, and this was the major figure that was picked up about there being 6 million medical tourists by 2010, 750,000 in the US. And they have two references. Could you think, well, there must be a basis upon which they've said that? So they've got two references. So we trace those references because this is very important. If you're a government, if you're a business and you're going to invest in this amazing opportunity, you'd like to know where their numbers are coming from. The first reference takes us to this, the India Daily, an online, non-peer-reviewed source, which is now defunct. And they say there are 750,000 Americans. So that's not really much use as a source. We go to the next one, and this is a journal article, which is good, by Mike Horowitz and a colleague. But they reference the India Journal article. So we go back, we trek back, we could become circular. And then they say another figure of 350,000 patients travelling to Cuba, India, Jordan. So when we follow that, we get to another article, and that's got no reference for that figure. So what we find is we pursue these numbers, and we find ourselves in blind alleys or becoming circular. Okay? Now, that's a problem. Now, of course, there's difficulties of counting. Like, what do we count? Do we count individual patients? Do we count individual episodes of treatment? And I think there's some providers that do the latter and then use that to inflate the number of patients that are being treated within their facility. Often numbers aren't accessible. Why? Because there's private providers and they're very careful about sharing the size of their business. When numbers are accessible, they're frequently not comparable. And then we've got to decide, what's counting within this overall count. Do we include wellness tourism? Do we include cosmetic within medical tourism? Because the OECD wouldn't in their system of health accounts. Do we include cross-border and so on? And we start to get to this difficulty about who's counting, and very soon we get estimates, we get projections, we get extrapolations, and we get guesstimates. And we get fallacies. Okay? And again, towards the end of 2000s, early 2010-11, some of these points were raised by seemingly sensible people on very reputable platforms. So they'd say, there are 50 million Americans without health insurance. They could be treated within your system. Now, if you're a government or a provider, you're rubbing your hands thinking, that's great. We can get all these Americans to travel to Hungary or Poland or Thailand. That's a problem. Second thing they would say is there's a level playing field. All countries can take some of this business. Now, as social scientists or anyone with a historical memory, we know that institutions matter, history matter, and culture matters. That some countries are going to have various advantages over others. So not all countries can be open for business in the same way. And I do actually think that, looking back, that academics were really part of this myth-making, and that there are some disciplines which are inherently inflationary. You get a research grant, you get a paper published by generating something new. Lots of the early papers were data light or data free, and so they were really just trying to capture this new development, but without any detailed evidence. So that's a problem. And I think when we get away from that we've got this paradox, which is what we should focus on, which is most patients prefer to be treated close to home. So what are the boundary conditions to explain the unusual? So some people will travel out of jurisdiction, but it's going to be relatively unusual. And when we understand those conditions, then we're closer to a fuller understanding. Okay, I want to move on to say a little bit about demand-side networks. So within this discussion about medical tourism, there's a model of the market being circulated by industry stakeholders, and it assumes things about decision-making and treatment pathways of people that travel. And when you look at this notion of the market, it makes very clear insinuations about choice, about quality, about customization, and about consumerism. And really, those are the central discourses within a very classical, neoclassical model, and also the marketing management literature. So they were trying to encourage that view. But actually, when you look at what sort of market existed, it wasn't that flows were from each and every country crisscrossing the globe. Often there were very clear bilateral flows or relations that were very regional. So the emphasis was very much on Western Europeans and Americans travelling particularly to Asia. But when we looked at what the flows were, they were often of a very different nature, and often we could understand them by thinking about geopolitical things, colonial links and existing trade links, and how those were important in making sense of why some people would travel and did travel. There's also an assumption in the medical tourism market that was being shaped, that market exchange was very much about buyers and sellers acting independently. And this really seemed to fit with the encouragement that many were given in terms of how the market should be shaped, that individuals will have choice, that there's opportunities for everyone, small clinics, large clinics. You've just got to pitch your product right, get the appropriate quality price trade-off. Now, really, I think that ignores the role of intermediaries and network relationships, which are very important, because they help us understand how trust gets established and how markets get developed. So, there are certain really important networks on the demand side. There are cultural networks where patients, for example, will select a provider because of advice, relationships, socialisation they get within their wider cultural group. So we found this very clearly with a couple of groups in the UK. British Indians would travel for dentistry to an Indian provider, linking it up with a trip back home as maybe second generation Indian populations, but also based on informal recommendations that they received amongst friends. So it was that very similar discussion amongst Somali travellers. They would use their cultural network for information and then choose to travel to Germany or to Italy. We also see it with Mexican migrants or Mexican Americans living close to the border in the US. So we need to think about those cultural networks, but there's also these treatment-focused networks whereby individuals network in with discussion forums and self-help groups which are based around treatments and conditions, and they spend a lot of time with those communities, talking, sharing, asking advice. Particular ones we identified: bariatric, fertility and cosmetic. And how information flows in those networks is really important in terms of whether someone decides to make a trip or not. There's also supply side networks. And one of the things we can say is that often the role of clinicians is under-emphasised when there are academic and commercial discussions of medical tourism. Often the focus is on individuals choosing as individual consumers and making choices to travel. And actually our work in a number of ways, but particularly inward travellers into the UK, unearthed the importance of professional networks, where actually the UK, just as the US, just as Germany, not only have people travelling out for treatments, but also have people travelling in for treatments from the Middle East, elites from Africa, for example, and that's a long-standing flow. But those people don't simply choose in a very neoclassical way. They're firmly embedded in professional networks where clinicians have linkages and characteristics of very strong ties. So they might have trained or been based in a particular city, and then they refer from Qatar or from Saudi Arabia a particular patient they have to travel for more specialist treatment. Now all of that starts really to contrast this sort of very simplistic market model that medical tourism tried to encourage around buyer and seller making trade-offs around price and quality. What are some of the summary points then? Well, the flows of medical tourists are very different than perhaps the initial gold rush of 2009, 2010 suggested. There are some people that make consumer-driven decisions. There are some people that are facilitated by individual brokers. But networks are really important and central to understand what goes on in terms of medical tourism. That's why, for example, I would say that medical cities like Dubai Healthcare City and certain other places are unlikely to succeed. Okay? on the terms that they set themselves. I think if we think about networks, we moderate and mediate the emphasis on simple consumer choice. And I suppose what I'm saying overall is we should have less economics and more economic sociology and think about how these decisions are embedded. Now, why does this all matter? I think for two main reasons. The first is our theory is poorer without really understanding the role of networks. So we can't make sense of identity and risk and commodification, health inequalities that result from medical tourism without understanding the role of networks within that process. But there's also a really key set of implications for policy. And the first one is that if you support that notion that numbers were inflated and that certain sorts of medical tourists were seen as being the only ones that exist within that particular setting, so typically very wealthy Western patients travelling to lower middle income countries, then countries need to take a real reality check on how much activity they can attract. The numbers aren't as big, and if people are likely to travel for particular reasons, then it may be that not all countries are open for business and able to attract activity in the way that they were hoping to. And what does that mean? Well, it means that national government's role may be fairly circumscribed in terms of what it can do to obtain some of this global economic activity. And my sense is there's a growing realism that's emerging in terms of that medical tourism marketplace. Just to acknowledge my funders, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lee, for your presentation. Does anyone have questions for you? Yes, Professor Conrad?
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for your interesting lecture. I just would like to ask whether when you talking about the medical tourism, do you include the patients that go to the charity hospital? I mean, not making any profit to the hospital. Because
which hospital, sorry?
For example, like government-based hospital, which charge the patient very low with some subsidized.
Yeah, but
that happened in Thailand. When they're talking about the medical tourism number, they ask the private hospital only. But in the real life situation, the government hospital, especially along the border, now so they fill up with the patients from nearby country using our medical healthcare system, and that's a lot of patients. Even in the medical university alone, as my working place, we found about 200 patients that is not Thai every day that coming to like 70,000. And university hospital is a non-profit. So this usually not included in the numbers, figures of the country. Another thing is, as you mentioned, the fertility treatment. For example, in the recent situation, those seeking medical treatment for surrogacy and oocyte donation, which is considered as gray area and maybe illegal, they will be going under-report, and it's covered up in every treatment cycle. Just a few months ago, when the government tried to dig out the problem, and we found maybe more than 6,000 patients coming from Europe, America to Thailand every year, at least 6,000 cycles, 6,000 couples. So this never been reported, and maybe more than that, because it's somewhat illegal situation. How do you cope with this?
I feel really good points. I think the first point about who we count as medical tourists, the work that we've been doing along with colleagues has really tried to broaden that debate. What you've said there about people travelling to Thailand that share a border is a really significant one, but it also happens in Africa as well, where but when we talk about global medical tourism, the typical model of a patient is not someone that's travelling in that way from Laos or travelling from Indonesia to Malaysia. Our view is that you've got to actually see those exchanges as medical tourism, and actually really move attention away from the expectation that medical tourism is always high-end patients travelling from wealthier countries to be treated in your particular health system. So very much so, and I think that's a really important rebalancing in the literature, rebalancing. I think that the second point you make is a really interesting one, and I'm aware, for example, the difficulties of getting good, reliable data. It's always going to be tricky because of private institutions and private interests. A couple of examples. Bumrungrad for a long time have produced numbers, and I just don't see how those numbers can stack up unless they're talking, for example, about episodes of care rather than individuals. The numbers just don't add up. It's always going to be difficult to come up with reliable data, but we've got to try as social scientists. And there are ways to do that. So I think about colleagues at the London School that have recently been working with colleagues in Thailand to do an audit of, I think it's only 60% of hospitals, but to actually try and look at some of that with more certainty. So it's difficult, it's not impossible, but what we should always resist is this tendency to inflate without good reason in terms of numbers.
Can I start?
Oh, you can shout.
Yeah.
You can come and stand here and we can just...
So I'm Luca Marelli from the University of Milan, and thanks for your presentation. I've got a curiosity. So in your research, have you looked at how within the affluent world, so let's say Western countries, different political cultures actually create different, let's say, regimes of hopes or different kinds of expectations that foster the medical tourism? So look at differences between countries in this way?
Look, our work was really looking at British residents that travelled out of the UK. But even within that, you see some interesting dynamics. So, for example, when we spoke to people that were travelling for dental work and some fertility work, you could often see a connection. So someone might have been resident in London for the last 15 years, but actually for some treatment they were going in some way home because a particular treatment was offered that wasn't available within the UK NHS system. So in terms of cultural decisions, influences, yeah, really, really important. And I think we can see that obviously in terms of fertility decisions and fertility treatments as well, but also I suppose with some of the bariatric decision making that was made. So I think, although we haven't got the evidence that directly supports that, yeah, it's a very important consideration.
Yeah. Thank you for the stimulating talk, and thanks for the question as well. It was a very good question, and I had something similar in mind. You put it very nicely, and I was wondering, probably you already answered, but I was wondering if there are any differences between patients who travel because they are referred by a doctor from the National Health Service or sponsored by the government, and people who travel, you know, or from out-of-pocket expenses and on their own devices. Does that make a difference to medical tourism? And then I thought of this very interesting case that was in the news recently in the UK about this little boy who was in the NHS. I don't remember the condition, but it was he had a tumor, a brain tumor, and the parents. He was in a hospital in the UK, NHS hospital, and the parents decided probably that he wasn't receiving appropriate treatment, and it was a matter of life and death. So they took the boy to Spain and to other countries to seek for appropriate help, because it was only a matter of days, I think, and a life and death situation. And then the NHS alerted the authorities and they were arrested for taking the boy to another country. So here you have another case where the authorities and the NHS are not facilitating movement, but they're stopping people from moving to other countries. So I was wondering if that's of any interest.
Okay.
And another thing that came to mind, I'm sorry if I'm going to divert things to a different area that might not be of interest, but talking about life and death, what about people who travel to the clinics in Switzerland to die?
Okay.
Yeah, so I was wondering.
Okay. I'll try and wrap some of those things up with some comments. Yeah, there is some really interesting evidence of people travelling having been referred. The difficulty with, like, the NHS has been very reluctant to send people out of the UK and pay the bill. Why? Because if it does, if it refers you as an NHS patient, it basically deals with anything that goes wrong. So it's got to go over to France and Belgium and to do lots and lots of checks in terms of ensuring that that facility is of a particular standard. So the UK did that in the early 2000s. It referred, gave patients a choice to go to Germany, Belgium, France for hip surgery, and it would never do it again because it was a very time-consuming, very costly, and there wasn't much take-up of it. So it does happen. When people pay out of pocket, they go individually. They carry all the risk themselves, and so that's the major difference there. We do see a lot of Middle Eastern patients funded by ministries and national government treated in London and some of the larger urban centres, and they are referred, and we never spoke to those groups, but I think that would give a very different insight into the sort of balance of risk taking. The third question. We would have loved to have done a study that incorporated all of these very edgy topics, the ones that journalists ask about when they ring up. But what we decided was we wouldn't look at stem cell. That was outside of our remit. We wouldn't look at euthanasia, and we didn't look at live organ transplantation as well. There are some studies that have done that. So that was the third question. The second one, remind me again.
It was about the little boy whose parents were arrested because they travelled to another country to get treatment.
Yeah. Lots of interesting things. I'll probably leave that for the ethicists. We know that there are a small number of children that travel overseas. There's very little empirical work on that. We know that they travel for certain sorts of things because those are the issues that tend to be picked up in the media coverage. I think the case was really interesting for a number of reasons, one of which was how the media generated the discussion around that. And actually, I think when you look at the issue, it wasn't. The clinicians argued that his health wasn't in as much urgent danger as you might have thought. That the prognosis was good in the UK, and it was simply not. That they thought that was the best treatment to pursue.
I also have a question about the definition of medical tourism. I think under the context of international immigrations, nowadays people travel to work and live in different places so often, and it's hard to define where is home and where is and like me, and so I work here and my home country is Taiwan, and there is a very good health system there as well, here. So every time when I go back home, I will plan that I'm going to a dentist and like that. So it's also have these immigrants, it doesn't really make profit to the health system in Taiwan. it's actually bring headache to them. Like a lot of people live in America and they would travel back to Taiwan to use the lab, like to take a health check and everything, and then go back to America. And so the government tried to solve this problem, but they, it's. So I'm also thinking that in this kind of situation, do you think this kind of medical tourism as well? But it doesn't really like take money out of a pocket, but it's different reasons. Yeah.
Okay, 2 examples. 12 months ago, there was the major discussion in the UK about the migrant health levy, about charging individuals to use the NHS through a levy. And what was really interesting in that discussion paper was when you looked at people that were using the NHS who weren't entitled to it, there was a large group of British expats who were based in Spain and France and Greece who actually weren't eligible to use the NHS. But when they came back to see friends or to see children at Christmas, they'd go and see their GP, or they'd maybe get their meds updated. So there's a real issue there about, if we're looking at eligibility, we've got to be very clear about people not being eligible or being eligible. So that's the first thing there. I think some countries do go against what you've said though, and I think you're right. You've got this issue that if people are going to travel in and be treated, but they're not paying into the tax system, then that's a drain. But countries such as South Korea, it's been one of their major targets to attract American Koreans, diaspora, and so they have offices in the US, but they also target the Korean diaspora that's worldwide. When they first started developing medical tourism as a brand, as a national strategy, that's not what they had in mind. They wanted what everybody else wanted, which was wealthy Middle Eastern patients from Europe travelling for what is very good high-end surgery. The emphasis, I think, has shifted significantly there. They focus very much on Oriental medicine. They realise some of the target markets include China, include Japan, because of the relative lack of emphasis on some of those treatments there, and also Mongolia and Russia. So sometimes the market emphasis does shift.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. I think there might be time for more questions at the end. But now I'd like to invite Alessandro for the presentation.
So as I set it up, let me take the time to thank again Nataka for the invitation. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be here. So my talk today is very much case-based, and I'll try to stick to the 20-minute assignment. So I would like to start off reading a quote, and the quote reads as follows. It says, I would like to ask you and your colleagues to recognize the revolutionary potential of adult stem cell research and therapy. The potential that these have on our national health, quality of life, and economy. With these words, in a letter sent on July 25, 2011, longtime Texas Governor Rick Perry invited the Texas Medical Board to consider the alleged therapeutic virtues of autologous adult stem cell therapy, while drafting permissive regulations on their clinical use. Rick Perry himself, in the summer of 2011, received an autologous stem cell-based treatment for back pain. Interestingly, the physician that performed the intervention, Dr. Stanley Jones, is the vice president and co-founder of a company called Celtex, Celts and Texas. Celtex offers for roughly $20,000 a comprehensive package including the retrieval, purification and reinjection either locally or intravenously, of stem cells isolated from patients' fat tissue. And this, of course, is Rick Perry in an unusual white coat visiting a major lab in Texas. Now, the method of cell culture and banking that Celtex uses were initially licensed from South Korean company RNL Bio. You can see there in the picture a press conference celebrating the deal, which was a $30 million deal in December 2011. Celtex is funded currently by some 30 oil and gas investors who are financial supporters of Perry's gubernatorial campaigns, as is Celtex itself through its president and co-founder David Eller. So you see in the picture David Eller and Stanley Jones. The activities of Celtex did not escape the attention of the FDA, that in a warning letter that you see in the slide, dated September 24, 2012, notices that Celtex cell products are more than minimally manipulated and should be regulated as drugs, an issue that emerged in the previous discussions. And yet, prompted by the letter of Governor Perry, the Texas Medical Board held stakeholders and expert meetings and finally issued new practice guidelines for the use of investigational agents. This is the name of this piece of guidance, stating that administering or providing investigational agents constitutes the practice of medicine and therefore can be offered to patients under the sole responsibility of a licensed physician. Now, notwithstanding the possible emergence of a more permissive regulatory environment in Texas, Celtex did not wait for favorable conditions to fully emerge, and after it received the warning letter, actually the company changed its business model. Now, at present, the company is still offering the retrieval, culture, and conservation of fat-derived stem cells, but it has transferred the reinjection of cultured cells for paying patients into selected clinics off the borders of the United States, namely in Mexico. Now, at this juncture, I'd like to stress what seems to be a hallmark of stem cell tourism these days. Now, to a large degree, this phenomenon is caused, or at least reinforced, by the very activities whereby public authorities try to implement existing rules and legal categories. So the two remaining case studies I'm going to present today offer further confirmation of this hypothesis and actually invite a reflection on the trade-offs in regulatory activities. Now, the Centeno Schultz Clinic, based in Broomfield, Colorado, is the headquarters of Regenerative Sciences, a company that has developed proprietary mesenchymal stem cells products that are focused on bone and joint pain applications. And the product line of Regenerative Sciences is called RegenX. Now, in 2006, RegenX started offering RegenX C. C stands for cultured, a product consisting of more than minimally manipulated cells. These bone marrow aspirates are allowed to grow for a few weeks so that, according to the company, the number of mesenchymal stem cells can increase. Within 2 months from harvesting, the cells are re-injected in the patients at the site of injury. So in July 2008, the FDA sent a warning letter to Regenerative Science concerning RegenX C, claiming that the procedure actually qualifies as the administration of a biological drug under FDA regulation and cannot be distributed for clinical use without an authorization of the FDA. 2 years later, in early August 2010, the Department of Justice, on behalf of the FDA, filed an injunction to halt the commercialization of RegenX C. Dr. Centeno, who is the founder of Regenerative Sciences that you see in the slide, actually replied that although he was not acting under FDA oversight, he was on safe grounds, for the procedure was part of the practice of medicine, so again this argument, and moreover he was following the guidelines of the International Cellular Medicine Society that he co-founded some years ago. Again, this is the a scientific society that was mentioned in one of the previous talks today. On July 23, 2012, the court rejected these counterclaims and actually upheld the injunction. Now, when Nature reported on the FDA injunction against the clinic, some patients started to post comments on the journal's website, and these comments actually, I believe, deserve some closer look. For example, a terminally ill patient claimed that the practice of medicine really needs to be between a doctor and his patient, and that to not allow autologous stem cell treatments for the terminally ill in the US is a travesty. As to the FDA's injunction, the same patients commented, patients are left wondering why the scientific community fails to ever consider what we want. So you can actually grasp the rhetoric behind this. And along similar lines, another comment said that another comment applauded Regenerative Sciences for standing up the FDA. It says, "It is about time someone did." And added that, "I don't know what it is, but it should be up to me and my doctor to decide what is the best treatment for me, not a government agency." Now, as a direct result of FDA's activity vis-à-vis RegenX-C, the company exported its activities on more than minimally manipulated cells offshore. A brand new clinic was created in the Cayman Islands in order to escape the regulatory action of the FDA. And here patients can obtain the RegenX procedure, paying out of their pockets and avoiding any interference from US public authorities. So again, as in the case of Celtech's efforts at enforcing restrictive regulations, regulation actually fueled medical tourism to an offshore location. This is from the side of providers. Now, the next and last case I want to present is actually taking place in Italy. It started a few years ago, but it's still ongoing and very, very famous. For those of you who follow a little bit stem cell politics this day. So in Italy, starting in 2009, a private group called Stamina Foundation has been selling cell-based therapies to patients affected by a variety of serious neurodegenerative disorders under a compassionate use framework. Stamina cell products, consisting of bone marrow aspirates, claim to contain mesenchymal stem cells instructed to produce neural fate differentiation before being reinfused into patients. Now, in late 2011, for reasons that are still the object of judicial investigation, the method was made available in a public hospital, so at the expenses of the taxpayer. And this fact occasioned an inspection by AIFA, which is the Italian FDA, resulting in an inhibitory injunction against Stamina. So later that year, a number of patients and family turned to courts against the injunction, claiming that the infusions were actually exerting some therapeutic function. Here again you see a tension between the standards, the evidentiary standards of medicine, and the proto-evidentiary standards of seeing, of witnessing, a theme that was covered in a previous presentation. So quite surprisingly, in August 2012, a judge ordered to resume the treatment for a 2-year-old girl called Celeste, who was affected and is still affected by spinal muscular atrophy. The judge based her decision only on the testimony of her parents. Now, the case made headlines, and a deluge of hundreds of similar judicial orders were following. to the extent that by March 2013 the Ministry of Health issued an ad hoc decree and formally authorized the continuation for the therapy. Now, also in this case, as in the case of Texas, whereas existing regulations would prohibit the provision of unproven cures, the legislator finds a way to make the latter available to patients. Moreover, the stamina method, previously commercialized to patients and now offered for free, actually entered the public healthcare system. Now, at present, however, the situation for patients claiming access to the treatment is rather patchy. For those who had already started cycles of infusion, the decree that I just mentioned is valid. But for other patients, the decree would not grant access to the method, but nevertheless, they may receive judicial support for their claims, and they're actually receiving some judicial support. So far as medical tourism is concerned, the stamina case differs from the previous two. The alleged cure was offered in Italy, okay, but the first patients were treated in a cosmetic institute in the Republic of San Marino, which is entirely in the territory of Italy. Now, it's interesting to notice that the method was originally imported from Ukraine, where the founder of Stamina himself, who was suffering from facial nerve paralysis, traveled to receive unproven stem cell therapy. Therefore, in this case, stem cell tourism is at the origin of the medical and regulatory controversy. It has to be pointed out, nonetheless, that as public authorities started to foreclose access to unproven therapies, Stamina and a host of patient groups that had grown in the meanwhile, thus making the case for the importance of networks, actually said that they were ready to move abroad to a more permissive state. And in particular, they organized contacts in Capo Verde, off the coast of West Africa, to establish a clinic. The business plan promised huge returns on investment for Capo Verde and a boost for the economy. According to investigators' reports, the plan was discussed by Stamina at a meeting with the Capo Verde ambassador in Rome, and it was based on initial funding by a cooperative of 500 patients who would pay 8,000 euros each to get the treatment, whereas the subsequent patients would pay 500,000. Now, although the project never really took off so far, it is interesting to see how, once again, stem cell tourism to distant or exotic countries can be seen as a consequence of regulatory activities in the Western world, and is thus better understood as regulatory medical tourism in the first place. So this creates, obviously, quite a regulatory dilemma. Now, I want to say a few words in these last 5 minutes about stem cell tourism as a global phenomenon. Now, in the current legal and ethical literature on medical tourism, there is a clear realization of the fact that this phenomenon is